Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Our 2020 virtual season is broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe.
Hi there, I'm Lucy Van Oldenbarneveld. Thrilled to be here at the Ottawa International Writers Festival again. I'm usually a host at CBC Television, but I also love these hosting jobs a lot, and especially when you get to speak to authors like we have today. Sarah Smarsh grew up in rural Kansas. With her 2018 memoir, Heartland, she used her family's history to talk about the rural poor, working class, and the systemic barriers that lock them into sometimes repeating patterns of poverty and abuse. She also highlights the incredible strength of women in her memoir. In her new book, She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs, she takes the patron saint of the rural poor, Dolly Parton, and shows how the brilliant songwriter and businesswoman has always called her own shots well before people realized what she was up to. Dolly Parton has also always modeled an unstated feminism and a huge generosity. Sarah Smarsh joins me now from rural Kansas. Hey there, Sarah.
Hi, Lucy. How's it going?
Good. So great of you to join us. Now, maybe we can start by the idea for this book. Why and where did the idea come from that you wanted to look at Dolly Parton and the bigger meaning of Dolly Parton?
Sure. So it's kind of an interesting origin story, I think, in relation to our current political moment, actually. In 2016, I was finally under contract to write the book you mentioned earlier, Heartland, which I had been working on for many years and trying to get an agent and a book deal and all that stuff. Well, my dreams came true, and then I had this big deadline for a book that in some ways felt like my life's work. And simultaneous with that, a great country music magazine that out of the States called No Depression was advertising a new fellowship that would essentially give a writer resources to spend a year working in depth on some topic that related to the intersection between roots, country, Americana music, and culture and broader social progress. That year, 2016, of course, was a crazy election year in the United States, not so unlike 2020. It was kind of the dawn of our current political era. And as someone who comes from rural Kansas, as you mentioned, I was, and also as someone who, as a journalist, is a member of the media, I was really kind of stricken and heartbroken by the onslaught of headlines about the space that I come from, kind of portraying it as a cultural and political monolith where everyone is for a certain candidate and everyone is, just to distill it, basically bigoted. And there was a lot of misogyny going around that year because we had a female Democratic candidate. So I was thinking a lot that year about gender and class as it relates to, as they intersect and as it relates to kind of our social progress. And meanwhile, I'm writing Heartland. I'm thinking, I don't have any time to dig into this sort of thing, but I applied for the fellowship and pitched this idea to this great little magazine, No Depression. Let me write about Dolly Parton as an exemplar of working class feminism, as a strong woman who is indeed from, rural America, and yet has nothing to do with any of these headlines about hate and kind of regressive thinking. And I got the gig, and then, as I mentioned, I was already working on Heartland, so it was like, oh man, now I've got to do both of these things at the same time. So that was quite a juggling act, but it was sort of a labor of love. It was really a passion project. I thought that a few hundred people were going to read it because, this magazine has kind of a niche readership. But happily, several years later, then my publisher said, let's turn that stuff you did into a book.
Yeah. So, and Sarah, I mean, and also class and gender, but also misunderstanding in many ways, right? I mean, that is a hallmark of who Dolly Parton has been, on how we've all, misunderstood her and didn't expect all that she is capable of. So, can you just take us back to Dolly Parton's roots and where she came from, her beginnings, and how it shaped the woman she was?
Sure. Well, just to touch quickly on your first point in that great question, it is this book, like a lot of the things I do, is very much a kind of what I see as like a corrective to a stereotype, as you say. And the reason that Dolly Parton is a great kind of springboard to that sort of discussion is she was born in deep poverty in East Tennessee in a holler to, two hardworking people, a farmer slash carpenter, and her mother bore 12 children. They were so poor that they paid the country doctor who delivered Dolly in 1946 with a sack of feed rather than with currency. Um, and she grew up, as by her own telling, with a lot of love in the family, but of course real economic and financial deprivation. So she was kind of born to be a star. She knew that she wanted to be a performer and that she had a gift to give at a very young age, and she started singing on local radio shows even as a child. Then in the 1960s, she kind of declares to her friends in this high school, where she was, in fact, the first person from her family to graduate from high school. She said, "I'm going off to Nashville to be a star." They laughed at her. And in fact, she had a kind of bittersweet relationship with folks like that in her home, because what we know of Dolly today is this sort of kind of force of self-expression, whether that's in her kind of over-the-top clothes or her really big wigs, or the way that she presents, which is she carries herself with a real self-possession. In the 1960s, which wasn't all that long ago, these were kind of radical acts for a woman, and particularly one where she comes from. And the fact that you tie into that boldness some real independent ambitions in the realm of country music, which at the time was very much still a patriarchy. Women didn't even they hardly ever headlined shows. The laughter that she heard when she told folks her dream was in many ways kind of a sexist, finger wagging to say, your job right now is to go find a husband and start making babies. So Dolly Parton, of course, fast forward half a century, and we know her now as kind of an icon. But along the way, between that setting off for Nashville on a Greyhound bus and the height of fame and fortune where she resides now, along the way, she had to face over and over, often male executives in the industry that she was trying to break into, diminishing her, underestimating her talent, intentionally attempting to hold her back when they were threatened by her talent being greater than theirs. And she handled all of that with a sort of famous grace and often humor, maybe a little bit of bravado. And that's why, to my mind, she is, and by the way, always with acceptance and celebration of a very diverse fan base. So there are a lot of ways in which she kind of arose from those humble origins. She's never turned her back on those origins. That place and people is very important to her. But she has come to embody a really transcendent and kind of rare form of positivity and goodness that really is counter to a lot of the things that you hear about what kind of people live in rural America today.
And so she's just so fascinating from that regard, where she carefully crafted her image to, in her words, represent the town trollop. And she saw this as a sign of strength as well, but she was often, as you say, made fun of because of it, and also maybe not taken seriously by some. Yet she stuck with it. She stuck with that image and saw that it was a source of strength for her. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Because she was made fun of when she went into show business later on. She was a punchline for a lot of years. Why did she hang on to that image, and what did it mean to her?
Well, I think that she hung on to that image because even as it is a performance of sorts, and she's, a brilliant and calculated businesswoman in terms of these sorts of decisions, it also is true and authentic to her. So I think to really get at the full answer to your question, we need a little bit of context about how gender plays out where she comes from. So she's born in the middle of the 20th century. There's still very rigid gender roles and conformity reigns. It's before really the onset of what would be called the second wave feminist movement or the women's liberation movement of that happened later in that century. And there, in the place that she comes from, her relationship to symbols of femininity that movement a couple decades later would declare oppressive were for her paradoxically things that she longed for. So what do I mean by that? Like if in the 1970s you have a self-declared feminist who says I reject makeup and high heels and wearing, at the time it would have been like a girdle, which was basically kind of descended from the corset known today as Spanx. And she, Dolly Parton, was in a place that couldn't afford those things. And when she in magazines saw middle class or affluent women, with the makeup and the coiffed do and the painted fingernails, she associated that with some economic agency that she understood the women in her place didn't have. Because you got to understand, like, they're women of Dolly Parton's native class were working all along. There wasn't any like liberating them from the home. They were always working in various capacities with dirt under their fingernails and dirt all over their face. And there were ways in which, the kind of stereotypical image of what's feminine and what's masculine were just it is quite different in a space like poor rural East Tennessee in the middle of the 20th century. So Dolly associated a kind of class climb with the ability to possess the very same frilly and indeed perhaps oppressive things that middle and class and affluent women would soon be rejecting. So that's the first thing to understand, is that kind of connection that she's making about power, and also to some extent her own power as what she understood to be a objectified kind of female form. So as she comes of age, then she's realizing like, oh, I don't have much power in the world, but I can tell that when men look at me, there is something going on there. And then from that, she, through that lens, she sees this woman walking through the small town where they would do their shopping. And she thought this woman just like exemplified beauty. And she had, big peroxide, probably bleached hair and lots of makeup and really tall high heels. And her mom said, oh, she's trash. She don't look up to her. And Dolly found some beauty about her and said, well, that's what I'm going to be when I grow up, then, trash. The kind of joke she tells often. And yet it's not just a joke. It's true and authentic to her that she would continue, as you say, for decades to intentionally embody that look and present herself in that way, which I happen to think is a real declaration of solidarity with the place that she comes from. She's been rich for a long time and she's a very smart woman. She could have classed herself up a long time ago. So there is something, whether you want to call it political or not, of a statement in the way that she has chosen to, in the face of being made a punchline, continue to force people to reconcile, frankly, her creative genius and her good heart and her business acumen and brilliance with an outer shell that they associate with foolishness or, a kind of silly caricature of some kind of backwoods buffoon.
And she really has been in almost total control of that image since the beginning. It was like she had mapped out her life in many ways, just in terms of how she's managed the genius of her songwriting and her career, and even the subtle messages that she sends without putting labels on it. And I want to ask you about her first big hit. She was on the Porter Wagoner show. She recorded Dumb Blonde. And that song, this Dumb Blonde Ain't Nobody's Fool. What was going on for her at the time, and what did that song actually mean?
Well, first of all, it's a great, catchy 1960s ditty. If folks watching haven't listened, you should check this song out on Spotify or wherever. And it has aged well. But the lyrics of this song, which by the way, Dolly Parton didn't write. This is kind of one of the ironies within her career. She thinks of herself as a songwriter first, even before performer and singer and all that. And indeed, she is the writer of most of her hits, and she's quite prolific. She's published like over 3,000 songs that have been recorded by many artists. But a man happened to write that song that she very much connected with, and in many ways, the statement of this song, which is, "You may see me as a dumb blonde, but you will underestimate me at your own peril." The theme of that song would end up being kind of the recurring theme of her career and her life. And one of the reasons I love this song, and one of the reasons it's so quintessentially Dolly, is it's not really even a complaint. It's certainly not a whine. It's not a lament. She's not saying, "You've broken my heart because you don't understand me." Frankly, the person singing this song could care less whether he understands her. What she's saying is, I see that you have underestimated me, and I guarantee you that I will get the last laugh because indeed I am smarter than you are.
Yeah, and she in her songwriting, you never underestimate her. So can you just talk about the radicalness of her songwriting in many ways, whether it's Jolene or Just Because I'm a Woman or the Bargain Store? Just explain a bit about what she was up to and how radical she actually was.
Well, let's go back to her early songwriting. So in the 1960s, as a very young woman, she's writing very dark lyrics about basically the trials and tribulations, specifically of poor rural women who had at the time, and these problems certainly have not been solved, but we have made some progress in policy terms. They faced domestic violence, lack of choice in regard to their reproductive systems and own health as women. Certainly, a lack of financial resources, which makes a woman's vulnerability to all of those other dangers all the more severe for lack of recourse or ability to leave a dangerous situation. And also at the time, again, this is fairly recent history, but it was much more the expectation was that she would marry very young and start having children. And to some extent that was an expectation across class lines, but it definitely impacted a rural poor female like Dolly all the more. And she managed to escape some of those outcomes in her own life, but a lot of her early songs are basically telling the stories of those women who she went to school with, who she knew firsthand, who she loved dearly, who didn't escape those outcomes. And she seems to be making an expression of solidarity with those women, and making sure that folks are hearing their stories. So the radical nature of the story she's telling was such that a lot of radio stations wouldn't even play her music. You mentioned the song "Just Because I'm a Woman." This is from 1968, and it basically, even though it doesn't use the term double standard or slut shaming, it's basically articulates that experience of being a woman, She, never made any bones about the fact that she's a sensual and sexual being. And that was something that would be shamed, today to some extent, but certainly for her. She grew up in a very strict patriarchal religion. Her grandfather was a preacher, and her kind of like taking burnt matchsticks and using them as eyeliner for lack of money for makeup, that was like Jezebel stuff to her folks. And then when she did actually end up getting married not long after she got to Nashville, and the impetus for the writing of this song, according to her, was her new husband, asking, "Oh, and by the way, I assume that I'm the only person that you've been with." And she's like, "No, no, actually, you're not." And he was so heartbroken and mopey over this that she wrote this song that says, "You've done your things, I've done mine. If they are mistakes, they're no worse on my part for my being a woman." A lot of radio stations wouldn't play it. It ended up actually being a #1 hit in South Africa, of all places. So it is something that it's a declarative song that is really transcendent, even though it comes from a woman who grew up in Appalachia. Women around the world could relate to it for sure.
And you mentioned her husband there, Carl Dean, who she was married to in the early 60s. And as far as we all know, they're still married, right?
Yes.
A bit of a mystery husband. But she also decided not to have children. So how do you think that has fit into the decisions she's made around constructing her life?
What a great question, because, as she was really coming into her own as a superstar, so you might roughly call that pretty much like the decade of the 1980s. She was just, pervasive in popular culture. She was in movies, on magazine covers, nighttime talk shows, and all over radio, both country and pop. And at that precise moment, she happened to be around 40 years old. So, sort of at the moment when biologically, women are somehow perhaps reckoning with that decision, if they have had the fortune of it being a decision. And she got interviewers would always ask her, why didn't you have kids? Are you going to have kids? And unfortunately, kind of overshadowing everything that she was doing professionally. But because of those interviews, she is on the record as having said, she would just kind of say, "Oh, I can't have children," and this and that. But later we find out, when she reflects on that same question, that even though she didn't not want kids, her own professional ambitions were simultaneous with that biological reality, and pretty much like superseded her would-be motherhood in a way that she has no regrets about. So that's a long way of saying she basically calculated that with as many disadvantages that she had attempting to do what she was going to do, it would be all the more harder if she were also a mother, and she decided to give it all to her career, and with happy results.
Right. Sarah, I want to ask you a couple of questions of her foray into the movies. And the first big one was 9 to 5, as you describe. And yeah, from my recollection of that movie, I was stunned to see you describe it this way. And had to think about this, but you're absolutely right. You described 9 to 5 as one of the darkest movies ever made about the female experience, one that probably would not get made today. Just remind us what was going on in the early 80s with this film.
Yeah, this actually, it came out in 1980, which happens to be the year I was born. So I think of it as kind of like I'm like I don't know, my generation is the offspring of that moment in terms of our gender progress. And so it would be on TV when I was a kid, and I would see the adults around me laughing, and so I had this association with it, and also just the timing of the film, the rhythms of it. It presents itself as a comedy in many ways. But in 2016, when I was first working on the writing that became this book, I was living in Austin, Texas at the time, and they have this great movie chain, which is now national, but originates there, called Alamo Draft House. And you go, they show iconic old films, and you go, they give you props, and you have it's, this big screen experience, but it's a movie you've already seen 1,000 times, and it's kind of a party atmosphere. You interact with the film, people shout, and so they screened 9 to 5, and a friend of mine and I went. And to go back to what I was saying earlier about 2016 and all the misogyny that was in the air at the time, and a lot of women were feeling, frankly, kind of traumatized by some of the political discourse as related to women, and even sexual assault. There in this movie were, these for those who haven't seen it, or just to remind you, there are 3 women. They work in an office in different capacities, and they all work under this kind of, classic archetype of the nasty chauvinist boss. And Dolly's character is what they then would have called secretary. And in the movie, he gropes her, he belittles her, and it is presented as with a sort of laugh and wink. But for women who have experienced that firsthand, it can be a kind of sobering thing to watch once you have kind of developed a more sophisticated understanding of sexism and misogyny, as we as a culture and society have done together over the decades since that movie came out. So when I'm in that theater in 2016, yeah, there was laughter and some jubilance, but there was women were angry, they were hurt, it was like a catharsis to watch this movie together. And it was palpable in that space, and it made me realize that it is indeed a very dark film. And further evidence for that hypothesis, I think, is that the screenwriter, who is a woman, has since revealed that her original script, what happens in the movie is there's this fantasy sequence where the 3 main characters, Jane Fonda, played by Jane Fonda, Dolly Parton, and Lily Tomlin, have this sort of murder fantasy. There's this fantasy sequence where they hog tie their boss. They've got a gun to his head. They throw him in the trunk. They think that they've killed him, and hilarity ensues, I suppose. But the original version of the script had them actually murdering their boss. And the studio heads were like, we're going to need these characters to be a little more likable than that plot line might allow for. So it was turned into a fantasy sequence. But what it's really about is righteous and understandable female rage.
Wow, yeah, in 1980, so 40 years ago. All through this, Sarah, Dolly has sort of eschewed the label feminist, but you describe her this way: the signature Parton trifecta, eyebrow-raising tight clothes, generosity of heart, and a take-no-crap attitude, and you describe it as an overlooked and unnamed sort of feminism. So what kind of feminist is Dolly Parton, and also what kind of feminists are the women that you know and love and live around in Kansas?
Well, they're certainly of a piece, and this is really the heart of the statement or thesis that my book puts forth, which is that whether you want to talk about feminism or any other philosophy and movement toward a more just society, there are often 2 sides of a coin in play in those movements. And on the one side, you have the folks who are articulating it, they're discussing it, they are tweeting it, they are debating it, they are, kind of developing on college campuses. They are fortifying in the professional space. They deem themselves activists. And frankly, they can afford to go to a march. Now, I should say, I don't want to speak in generalities here, because a lot of people make very brave personal and financial sacrifices to be present kind of on the streets in a very overt political way. And I'm not meaning to minimize that, but but historically, political movements are more accessible to more privileged people, whether that has to do with white skin or money in a bank account, or all the different kind of power continuums that determine the structures in which we work in this society, determine how hard it's going to be for you to be, engaged in an explicit way like that. Now, meanwhile, you've got folks who are perhaps living and embodying the tenets of such a philosophy or movement, like, say, feminism, which very simply asserts that men and women, or all genders rather, are equal and should be treated thusly. And they might not have even the same working definition of that term as the women who are marching with a shirt that says feminist, and yet they are experientially propagating and living feminism in their day-to-day lives and experiences and decisions. So to my mind, Dolly Parton is very much in camp B, and it has to do with, again, to go back to those sort of class fissures, where she comes from. So I mentioned she's the first person from her family to graduate from high school. She didn't, go to college. She straight off went off to become a country music star and was very successful at it. She's a brilliant woman. She has become very worldly in the decades since, and yet she is still very much a product of her place, where the realm of politics with a capital P might feel intimidating or inaccessible just for the language that the discourse uses. It can be very exclusive, the sort of jargon and what working definitions are we using for this discussion. That's not the culture that Dolly Parton comes from. However, she comes from very strong women, and she herself is one, as are the women who raised me and who I grew up around, who, to my mind, even if they are somewhat suspicious of the term feminism, which unfortunately has been successfully weaponized, to my mind, by some political factions who are counter to feminism's intents, they nonetheless are living it and being it. And that's not to say that the women in the marches and policy making rooms aren't living it, but there is certainly such a thing as a kind of hollow virtue signaling about a belief that if you're not walking the walk, you perhaps in some ways are not affecting as much change as someone like Dolly Parton, who lives by example.
And Sarah, I mean, your book was already finished by the time we saw the, Black Lives Matter protests take over. But Dolly Parton, maybe uncharacteristically in some ways, took a stand there, and she came out publicly to support the movement and to condemn what happened to George Floyd. How much in keeping was with her, her past was that, or was that a departure for her?
Well, it was not a departure in sentiment, and basically the content of what she put forth was a sort of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. So what I mean by that is, if you know her and her career and the way in which she has always been a voice of solidarity, I think would be the best word. In some implicit ways, I don't think the content of what she said was surprising. However, as you alluded to, the fact that she did make a sort of overt statement, of course, it was when asked by a journalist for Billboard magazine, but where she has in the past kind of hedged and hesitated to say, well, I'm a feminist, or she didn't even make any overt statement about the Me Too movement, for example. But in this case, she said, of course, Black Lives Matter. And I believe the next quote was, do you think our lily white asses are the only ones that matter? It's kind of classic Dolly with her wit and yet simultaneous grace, I think. And I believe the reason for that, there are many, and I'm just speculating, but I think that while she kind of stays off politics, she may well have seen that as what we might, instead of a political issue, deem a moral issue. If we are just talking about, whether a Black man deserves the dignity of being able to walk down the street without physical threat to his person by a white supremacist state. That's something that she has no problem making a call on. Like, of course, Black Lives Matter. So I think that was heartening for a lot of her fans and followers in some ways, because that slight shift in her approach really represents the shift in our times. We are not really in a moment where anybody can afford to stay silent if they're going to be on the right side of history.
Sarah, I have about a million more questions, but I think for the purpose of our interview today, I just have one more to ask you. Have you met Dolly Parton? Have you talked to her? Do you know if she's read your book? What can you tell us about that?
I have not had the pleasure of meeting Ms. Parton. In 2016, I, like a proper journalist, badgered her management and tried to get an interview. For whatever reason, I wasn't successful. She was on a big arena tour at the time. It might have been the kind of nature of what I was writing when I was, contacting, sort of pitching the interview, that sounded like it might be venturing too far into a kind of political realm. I don't know, but I will say that when the book came out and it got very fortunately, got a lot of good national attention, my publisher and I heard from basically a co-author who is helping her create her own book about her songwriting and lyrics, which comes out pretty soon. We got a note from her basically saying, "Hey, this sounds great. Would you send us a copy?" So I very hopefully and optimistically wrote a note to her and mailed that book myself. So she may be reading it. I don't know, and if she is, I hope she thinks that I got something right.
Oh, no kidding. And if you were to ever speak to her, and if she calls you to congratulate you on the book, what is the one thing, or maybe there are a couple of things that you would want to ask her that just hasn't come up anywhere else? What do you really still want to know?
Well, I guess what I would want to know is really, to my mind, the reason for this book and the reason that there is all this energy around her right now, in kind of improbably, frankly. She's a 70-something woman. She's past the age when the entertainment industry kind of kicks women to the curb. Maybe they get to come accept a lifetime achievement award, but they're not going to be, you know, just in daily discussion seen and heard as she is. And that kind of defiance and longevity, I think, has something to do with young women specifically connecting to her as a kind of, like, I don't know, I would almost say fairy godmother. She's kind of shifted from being the object of male fantasies to this an almost regal kind of queen-like force. And so I would just love to talk to her about what that experience is like for her. I think that she's always been a healer at heart, and she's always been a leader, and all of the things that young women are now responding to. But we were maybe missing it when she was being, for decades, reduced to kind of the punchline of a boob joke. So I guess I would just like to know how she feels about that role and what she senses about it, and what she plans to do with it.
Wow. I think that is a great place to end our conversation, Sarah. I mean, I would highly recommend this book and Heartland as well. You're a wonderful writer. This is a fascinating topic, and it's just been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks for the great questions.